Greetings, everyone. It is a joy to welcome you here. I'm Scott Matheny, your university chaplain. And as you know, this has been an ongoing series that our office has put together, Faith Over Fear, helping think together about some timely matters and to help us as a community pull together. It has been a joy to see so many different faces and thinking about and issues, and wanting to make sure you all know we are taping this again so that other students, staff, faculty can have a chance to enjoy this, and also for our guest so that he can maybe think about it and how he is using it. I know that we're a group from all around the community here, and it is an absolute joy to bring together today a dear friend whom I'm afraid to ask how long Reverend Dr. Derrick Harkins and I have known each other, but I'll give you a little backdrop. Some of you know that I was in New York City for many years as the university chaplain at Columbia, Barnard, and part of my charge was Union Theological Seminary, a great seminary that has brought distinguished folks from around the world, including Elmhurst's own Reinhold Niebuhr, to the teaching appointments. Derrick is a graduate of Boston University, and from there came to Union, New York. And in Union Theological, he had the joy of working at the great famous Abyssinian Baptist Church, one of the storied churches in the nation. It is a congregation that you should know about if you don't. It's part of your own educational platform. And in that, he came under some great leadership and took a degree of doctorate of divinity, has had a distinguished career around the nation in pulpits. But for our conversation tonight, where he and I wanted to start is while he was in Washington, D.C., serving at the very famous 19th Street Baptist Church as the senior pastor. And in that period of time is when Barack Obama is first elected as the president of the United States. And I was actually at that church outside waiting for Barack Obama to come to church to be received by Reverend Harkins. I, of course, couldn't get in because there were too many people, but it was a wonderful event. And you should know that in the midst of all of this, from that period of times when Reverend Harkins became a part of Barack Obama's community and work and team, he moved on into broader interfaith relations. He moved into interfaith relations with the Jewish community, with the evangelical community, and the Muslim community, and has then, through that period, into the last campaign of Joe Biden, working with the Democratic National Congress. So he has been a part of the DNC. And in that, he has remained a part of the local church. So there are some things that I want you to start to tip out, like the great congressman who said, all politics is local. And you should know something a little bit about when I introduce and bring someone of this person's caliber, the Black church. And knowing when I say the Black church, it's not monolithic, but it has a tradition that roots in slavery, and it comes out of oppression, and it talks about politics and faith in ways that some of us, like Scott, like your chaplain, white, Presbyterian, UCC, don't integrate in the same way. And in fact, that's how we got to tonight, is because Derrick and I have been close for so many years, and I think he's got a story to tell. And so as the Lenten journey that I've been reading and writing about every day, you have a story to tell. Reverend Harkins has so much to offer. We are a conflicted nation. We know that. We know that the divide is in Christianity and outside of the faith. We know that there are many places where we overlap and that we're all trying to heal with the coronavirus. In fact, he and I both have just received our final shots in the last couple of days. So I think that there's a story here to tell. And our format being framed tonight is to allow Reverend Harkins to offer a few opening remarks, and then I will pitch some questions that I have posed to him. And in that midst, I'd hope that you would type in the chat some questions, and we'll do this for about 30 minutes, 35, and then that'll allow us to engage in question and answer with Reverend Harkins, so that by 8 o'clock my time, 9 o'clock his time, because he's in beloved New York City and he needs to go see his wife and his daughters. We need to let him go at 9 o'clock, 8 o'clock our time. So I'm so thankful that all of you have joined us tonight. And we look forward to the rich exchange that it might stir your mind and heart and soul and give you an opportunity to think about how to build your own life, to help tell your own story. And so with that, and that little attempt at trying to invite you, Reverend Harkins, into the body here, we still hope for a day when we can have the joy of you gracing us with your physical presence on campus. And I know that's in the offing. Some of the faculty know that you have been on the list for me to bring here. And we have alums. I see one alum there who has an honorary degree from this institution. It's a great pleasure to have you here, Derrick. And I invite you to offer your opening comments to help bring us in together, and then away we go.
Thanks so much, Scott. It is truly a joy to be with all of you and the Elmhurst community. I really appreciate the opportunity to spend these moments with you. Scott, I won't belabor the fact that we have known each other now. I guess it becomes generational after several sets of 20 years. So I will just say that it has been a blessing from the outset on those in those storied days on Columbia and Union's campus. Let me begin this, being a minister, being a pastor, maybe the best thing to do is begin with a story or at least an account. And hopefully it encapsulates a little bit of some of the measure of what my life has been like in this amazing arena of the intersection of faith and politics and the public voices of those who give us leadership. So Scott mentioned standing outside on an incredibly cold January day in 2009, waiting to get inside. The president-elect and his family were going to be in worship with us that day. This was, by the way, this was pre Twitter and all that stuff in full fold. We were being as low key as we could potentially be. I mean, that's in quotes, with their coming to be with us. It certainly didn't stay that way. And by the time our sanctuary, which seats about 1,800, was packed to the brim, such that the fire marshals kept, poking in and looking and kind of being worried. And there were easily, several hundred more folk outside, including Scott. So sorry about that, Scott. Next time around, we'll make sure that you get in. But that visit, let me talk a little bit about what unfolded. That was the first occasion that then President-elect Obama and his family were going to be attending a worship service outside of the realm of the political campaign, which obviously had just ended a short while before. This was January, the Sunday before the inauguration, by the way. And so because it was the first occasion that they were going to be coming to a church, by the way, a church in Washington where, although Barack Obama had already been in residence as a senator, but people were beginning to think of, well, this is now where the family is going to be situated. So one of the things that people were giving thought to was where the Obamas, if they chose to choose a regular congregation to be a part of, where that might end up being. And so 19th Street was part of that conversation. By the way, just as a quick aside, you'll remember this, if you ever do come to Washington, and you do want to visit the 19th Street Baptist Church, you need to note that the 19th Street Baptist Church is on 16th Street in the District of Columbia. So do note bene. But the fact is that this was the first occasion that they were going to be worshiping in a context that potentially could be a church home since the time when the Obamas had been members of Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago. And of course, I think we all know that there was a lot that arose out of controversy there as it related to Pastor Jeremiah Wright, and it represented some difficult points of transition, if you will, during the campaign and beyond. One of the things about that whole saga, or I should say that whole unfolding, was that And I'm hoping that when historians really step back and write about the Obama presidency, they give merit to this such that it deserves. You may remember, maybe some of you don't, you might be too far back, but Barack Obama, in the face of that controversy, gave a speech in Philadelphia called A More Perfect Union. And it was a speech about the racial climate in the United States and his envisioning of what the future could be like. I often say that that speech that Barack Obama gave in Philadelphia in March of 2008 is comparable to Abraham Lincoln and his speech at the Cooper Union during his run for the presidency in 1860. I think they both had similar impact and effect. They both spoke to the issues of race, obviously coming from two very different points of origin, but I think they both had that similar kind of magnitude. So that was the backdrop between that occasion back in the summer of, or the spring of 2008 to where we found ourselves in the winter of 2009. And we knew that there was immeasurable scrutiny. There was scrutiny on the first family, or the first family to be, about them determining how faith would unfold in their lives. And there was scrutiny upon any of us who either might potentially be a place where they would come with any kind of regularity as a worshiping family, or for that matter, any kind of statements or et cetera that any of us might have made in the past. I braced myself, and appropriately enough, for whatever measure of scrutiny would come around anything that I had said that might be deemed controversial given the history that they had encountered. Fortunately for us, we were committed at that point in trying to give them a sense of authentic welcoming. And I'm happy to say that we succeeded at that point and beyond. And in the course of my unfolding relationship with the first family, it was always my pleasure to be able to, whenever they attended 19th Street, to give them that sense of open arms, but also in the other occasions in my interactions with President Obama and the first family as a whole. The thing I also want to say about that moment is that the scrutiny about that moment was twofold. It was resonant from what had occurred in the context of Trinity, but then it was also about the fact that here you had a climate in the country, probably not quite as stratified as it is today, but quite close, that we knew that anything related to faith or the expression of faith or the handling of the issues of faith would be a point of controversy or engagement. And so much to the point where a couple of the advisors to President Obama shared with me that we're the first family to choose to be part of our congregation, that we needed to be braced for the scrutiny that would attend that. And we understood that. And of course, they made a determination to be visitors to a number of congregations across DC over the years, which was absolutely fine. But we also, of course, because of the relationships that we had with them, knew that again, that scrutiny would not cease. And in fact, especially when it came to significant and controversial issues, there was always, I will say, there were growing voices, such to the point where I think now, again, the kind of stratification that exists was being foretold by some of the stresses and strains there. The last thing I'll say before kind of, by way of just opening up and making this transition is jumping way ahead. And it's been my privilege in the course of this past campaign season as part of the DNC again, to work closely with now President Biden and his team, and to really help in the messaging around the issues of faith. The thing that's, I think, quite interesting about Joe Biden in that regard is obviously the same issues that were sort of taking shape and taking form when Barack Obama was newly in office are still there now in measurable ways. But one of the things about Joe Biden that I think is sort of in some people's minds maybe a conundrum is that his faith and his facility with his own personal faith is so clearly understood and seen. that it sort of represents a challenge on both ends of the spectrum. It represents a challenge for those who want to assail him because they have different ideologies or theological perspectives. But it also represents, I think, I'm saying our side of the aisle, meaning those who might be more politically aligned with President Biden, because, there's always the question of, well, how does this balance out in a nation where there are no religious tests, where we want to make sure that there is freedom of religion, but also for some and for all, freedom from religion in terms of not having to be compelled, but somebody whose faith is very much a part of who he is. That's been evident from day one. It was evident at the inauguration, and while in many respects it is a tremendous strength, but I also think it calls us to the question of how do we make sure that faith is integrated into the larger conversation and into the public square in a way that is best serving the principles of how we understand faith in America. So that I sort of leapfrogged around there a little bit, Scott, but I just wanted to kind of give you a sense of both administrations and some of my interaction. I'm excited about sort of unpacking more as we go along, but letting that kind of be maybe my opening salvo.
Wonderful. That's great, Derrick. And maybe I'm going to dive us straight forward into some of these things, because obviously I'm anxious for, especially our students, to be able to start to integrate how they understand their life philosophy. I use the word faith. Some use spirituality. Some use intellectual rigor. How you integrate that into the public square, into political life. That's one area. The other area is really to go at this challenge, because we know Joe Biden is deeply faithful as a Roman Catholic, communion on a regular basis. It has sustained him in the loss of life, of love, and there is deep challenge within our Christian tradition, and not just in the Roman Catholic tradition, within all of our traditions, about how we line up. And there looks to be almost like an ideological boundary going on in a conversation in that. So I'm anxious for the community to start to understand, how do you see both the integration conversation, which is deep, I know, for you, because I know you so well, but also the challenge, the fight. And that fight is real. And I'm anxious to make sure that people hear that. And we've got some great faculty on campus. I know Connie Nixon is online here, and there's a bunch of other faculty that are here to help talk about both integration of faith and life and health, integrate, and deal with the challenge.
Sure.
That fight that's going on. And where do you find the strength to keep going, which is a third area.
Sure.
So not a 3-point sermon, but here you go.
I think that integration happens in a couple of ways. First of all, the inner fortitude that somebody has. And again, I think Joe Biden is a great example of that, because one has to always think about the tragedy of his narrative, in terms of personal loss, but yet he immediately talks about the inner fortitude that comes because of his faith. So that alone, and I think we do, anyone in the public sphere who relies on that strength, I mean, we certainly owe deference to them to find their strength in that, and we understand faith in a personal context there. The other piece, I think, of how this unfolds is that faith is the stabilizer, motivator, and underpinning for so much that represents the force for social good in our world. Think about the origins of so many movements. Think about the origin, my goodness, of the civil rights movement. It emanated from a context of the embracing of the fortitude of one's faith. We saw that in the slew of those civil rights leaders that, obviously Martin Luther King and John Lewis, and even, my goodness, even Malcolm X on the context of coming from a non-Christian place, but nevertheless a deeply anchored place of faith. So when we think about the movements of social justice, when we think about the movements of equality and equity, for so many people, they've been sustained in that work by their faith. And that faith has not been meant to be exclusionary or limiting, but has allowed for them to embrace that larger sense of purposefulness. I think about somebody like a Fannie Lou Hamer, my goodness, who represented the undaunting ability to stay the course, but she always talked about that being anchored in her faith. So I think that when we talk about where faith stands in the public square, the personal fortitude, of course. The fact that so much of what is good in the sense of moving toward efforts towards social justice has emanated from places of faith, wonderful. The challenges I think you're alluding to is how do we now in this day and age wrestle with the dichotomies, the fact that there are ideologies that are 180 degrees opposite of one another, but call themselves Christian. May call themselves, even from the other faith traditions. But I think the fact is that we have to wrestle with the fact that there are elements within the conversation of faith that didn't necessarily begin there. I mean, in other words, has there been an appropriation of some perspectives and ideas in the realm of faith that really didn't start out there? In other words, if I'm coming at you with a political position that is restrictive and diminutive of who you are and antagonistic to your personhood, does that really emanate from a faith tradition? And I'm trying my best to say that as broadly as I can, because I think it's a broad enough issue and concern, but I think that that's where we are now. I think we have to wrestle with that. I think that, and I'll let you, I think we are wrestling with it in some ways. I think the furtherance of voices in the progressive faith realm is in some respects part of a response to some of those issues.
I'm looking to the chat line just to start to help let you all start to ask questions, but I have a lot of them always. I want to keep pushing because you have used a great word called stratification. It's a sociological term that comes out of your training because of your sociological background and your degrees and study. How do you stratify U.S. society right now? How would you try to describe that stratification? One way I do is, and I use that word of language of faith. We also stratify it around some of the questions of political structures, race, gender, sexual orientation, class. Help us understand that term stratification in the challenge conversation that you as a faithful pastor work to help build bridges. Because ultimately, Derrick is always about building bridges.
I think that part of that stratification is because of where we are demographically as a country. As we approach mid-century of the 21st century, any person, demographer, whomever will tell you that the United States will shift from being a predominantly white nation to one of people of color. And that is possibly happening more rapidly than we may have even thought. I don't remember if the initial year was 2040 or 2050 or whatever, but we know that some of that is happening more readily. I think the disquietude that's unfolding because people have bought into the idea that transition means the full disruption of, quote, life as some know it. I think that has allowed for the kind of rhetoric that we've been hearing over the space of time, and not just within the last 4 years. That would be too easy to just simply identify it as happening only within the space of these last 4 years. I think it's broader than that. I think it's been brewing. I think a Barry Goldwater was able to be the Republican nominee in 1964 because it was antidotal to what people saw the civil rights movement doing. So I think that the concerns about the tipping of the scale have allowed people to come to a point where in some minds it might be almost deemed as desperation. And so part of what's the result of that is, I think that there are, for many people, that justifies the radicalism that we've seen, whether we saw it on January 6th on the steps of the Capitol, whether we hear it in the rhetoric of some, whether they be elected or non-elected officials. I think it points to the fact that for many people, that stratification is at a point where their concern is of being devalued and being displaced. And I think that it allows for a lot of ideologies to sort of graft on to those fears. And that's where we are. And that's one of the reasons I think that so much of that has unfolded even in the space where faith is at the center of the conversation.
So, and because of where I sit as a chaplain, and I'd love for this community to just think about this for a second, the first year students that we received would be more or less 50 years old in 2050, 2049. So those young men and women that I had the joy of welcoming in the chapel pre-COVID, and then in some crazy way last year with COVID, and you add 50 years, you then put them in a place where they are at the middle of this demographic shift. What are the tools that they need, Reverend Dr. Harkins, to help them in this demographic shift, in the kind of a democracy that we are desperately trying to hold together? And what will be the needed ability for young people as they morph into already leaders? It's not like we have to wait for them, they're already leaders. What do they need in this identity conversation and this challenge, conflict?
Sure. I wish I could sort of give you immediately sort of a theological premise. I have to give you one that's more in the realm of the public square. And I think that the promise of democracy, the promise of who we are as a nation should bolster their both their sense of optimism about really, if we become whatever we look like demographically on the ground, if justice and equity and fairness are part of the driving force of who we are as a society and as a nation, it just allows for us to be that much stronger as a nation. I'm encouraged because I'm hopeful that will be embraced. Look, I know that there are daunting sort of, again, countervailing elements around this issue, but I'd like to think that there will be enough sense of that moving forward. I mean, again, let's step away for a minute if we can, if that's even possible, from the sort of the political dynamics of this, or I should say the partisan dynamics of this, and just think about in our nation now. I mean, in the space of these last not even 20 years, we have had an African-American president. We now have an African-American, South Asian, Caribbean vice president. We have marriages that would have been, the vice president's marriage would have been deemed illegal in many states, not even a full generation ago. And so I think the fact that we have the kind of forward movement, and yes, it is halting, and yes, there is opposition on many levels, but I dare say that I'm persistent in my optimism that those kinds of examples will fuel a sense of vision for the nation going forward. And I think that, there is a persistence of hopefulness. Going back to what I said earlier on about what motivated people in the civil rights movement and other movements as well, that there's a persistence that even with opposition, the angels of our better nature will prevail. And I'm convinced of that. I'm convinced that vision of what we can be, what we must be, is, as a nation, is there. And come mid-century, when hopefully I'm a spry and energetic nonagenarian, I'll be able to say that, some of that enthusiasm has really evidenced itself. I'm hoping that that's the case. I feel like what we're seeing right now is again, I think are the throes of frustration because of the kinds of transitions that are inevitable in our nation.
It is certainly one of the pieces that I find great hope and work in and necessity in. You would expect this from me as your chaplain. For the team that's watching this, Derrick has been deeply involved in helping construct what I see as the interfaith, interreligious realities on the ground in our community in service and worship. So when I say I was trained by Will Herberger, the great sociologist, and the defining book of America was Protestant Catholic Jew, one has to ask what's missing in that conversation. And that book that was the defining book in America is so out of date. And Derrick has been deeply involved in helping construct a different narrative around religion, spirit, and faith. Could you speak to a little bit of the tensions of that you have worked with, Derrick, about building those kind of broad religious services, moments with immense joy, and also tensions?
Absolutely. Well, let me just start from the place of joy, as you say. One of the things that's amazing is the voices that are now a part of the ongoing conversation that point us to a broader sense of engagement, of inclusiveness, of what I think humanity in its fullest measure should look like. The fact that now, when you talk about Muslim engagement, I can reach out to Maggie Siddiqui, who is the head of religious engagement at the Center for American Progress, a Muslim woman who brings a broad sense of the understanding of that broader and larger conversation. When I talk about the Sikh community, two people who come to mind, and I offer these names up, and I encourage you to read their works and hear them when they speak. Valerie Kaur and Simranjit Singh, who are two amazing voices within the Sikh community, who again bring a sensibility and a broadening of that conversation. We've been fortunate at my time at Union Seminary to engage with the Buddhist community in the same vein, and I'm encouraged because we only do ourselves fuller justice when we understand that this is a part of the larger conversation that we must be a part of. Now, to your question about the tensions and the challenges with that, by all means, we find that, again, I think the frustrations of change visit themselves. Obviously here in New York, and I'm sure elsewhere in the country as well, you've probably been hearing about the significant uptick in violence aimed at Asian Americans. And of course, obviously I think much of that has to do with the unfair linkage to, the origins of COVID and whatever it might be. But I think it's obviously much deeper than that. And I think, again, the way that we respond to those kinds of issues is by broadening our sense of what is the understood reality that we live in. And part of that has to be, you're right. I mean, we thought we were doing something back in 2012 during the campaign to make sure that we had Christian and Jewish and Muslim voices. We knew in 2020 that we were not being authentic in regard to the religious identity of America unless we had, yes, Jewish and Christian and Muslim, but as I've said, also Sikh and Hindu and Muslim and Jain, and humanist voices as part of the conversation. So I think it is important and imperative to make sure and to be at the front end of making sure that that's what the conversation looks like.
So keep going on this, because one of the questions has been, with the nation so polarized, why should students believe that their engagement, their involvement, their work matter at all?
I think that's a great question. And the challenge in that question is, when do I see the results of my work, and how are they made manifest? I will tell you this. I I've had the pleasure, especially this last go around, of when I served at the Democratic National Committee, invariably, surprise, surprise, oftentimes being the senior presence in the office, and I counted it as an honorific and a privilege to be around so many amazing, incredible, driven, brilliant young people like everybody on this call tonight, at Elmhurst. And what was amazing about that was the fact that for so many of them, they had made the commitment to be in this work. And trust me when I tell you this, not from a cynical, partisan, solely political vantage point, but really to say, let me be in the public square. Let my energy, my efforts, and my voice be a part of what makes a difference. There are things that I believe in. I believe in justice. I believe in equity. I believe in inclusion. I believe in all those things that will make us a better place. And let me do that work. And trust me when I tell you that it may not be the broad sweeping changes that change the headlines of the New York Times, but it makes a difference. And I'll tell you, you'd be pleasantly surprised the close-in sort of human scale conversations. I remember during the course of the campaign, we would be in conversation with folk in places that, folk with my party affiliation weren't expected to go necessarily. And I'll give you an example. I won't say the state, but we had conversations with members of the LDS Church, younger people. And what was so fascinating is
LDS is the Latter-day Saints
my apologies,
of
yes.
Jesus Christ, or often called the Mormon community.
Thank you so much, Scott. I appreciate that. And the fact is that those conversations, believe it or not, were scant in their politics, scant in their partisanship. Believe it or not, we had conversations with them about the importance of moral forthrightness and uprightness and decency and honor, and how that unfolded in public life, and why they thought that was important. And so let me be honest, coming away from those conversations, didn't necessarily have a quantifiable sense of, okay, well, we've gotten X number of folk who we know are going to be in our column come election day. That really, believe it or not, wasn't the point. The point was, how can we make sure that these are issues that stay front and top of mind for people as they engage in public discourse? So the answer to the question is, you've got to understand it on that scale, that the impact you have is going to, yes, hopefully in some instances be such that you can be out there on whether it's election night or the passage of a bill, and you can be shouting from the rooftops because you've been successful, but also you're successful because you've had that kind of one-on-one, one-on-two, whatever, one-on-five engagement with people where you've talked about those kinds of values, and hopefully that there's something that's been implanted in that conversation that'll carry on and carry forth. So I would say, don't be discouraged by there's a passage, of course, in the New Testament, the battle doesn't always go to the swift, but to those who endure to the end. And I don't want to make it seem as if though this is solely going to be long-standing and long-enduring and difficult, but I will say that one's success, the measure of success, doesn't necessarily come in instantaneous, microwavable time slots.
So keep going, because there's one of the questions that is, I think, at the heart of a lot of our thinking is there are different understandings of reality and truth. And I often ask our communities, where do you get your news from? Because that will help us understand where you frame the concepts that we talk about or the events of the day. One of the questions is how do we work with those who have diametrically opposed philosophical, theological, political, economic understandings of reality? How do we work with that? And I guess let me throw just one question to help answer that, because I opened with the great congressman who's now dead, Tip O'Neill, all politics is local. And when I heard that first out of his mouth in New York, it said something about relationships, that you were going to be in relationship with people that would be diametrically opposed. But you had to figure out how to live and work together. And I know that that is a stream that's pretty Pollyannish, probably, you know, kumbaya. But what are the ways that we organizationally work with those who are diametrically opposed?
I think we're at a point now where it is absolutely, you know, in the span of my history in public discourse and politics, et cetera, I've got no problem. You know, my first occasions of going to the White House with any kind of substantive purpose behind them was when George H.W. Bush was president. George W. Bush, rather, was president. And John DiIulio, who started the initial Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, you know, we met with them with great anticipation for what could happen, even though, you know, I came from obviously a very diametrically different place politically. So those possibilities, I think, existed in ways that I think have been really, sadly, right now, have been really compromised in some respects. So there's a challenge there. I wish I could simply say, oh, well, it's, you know, you just, you know, you work with people even if you disagree with them. I think about the quote that it's sort of been making its way around social media in the last couple of months from James Baldwin, and where he says, we can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist. So that's my premise. I would say to somebody, I have no problem disagreeing with you if you've got ultra conservative perspectives around fiscal policy or defense policy, or even the social issues that obviously can be such, you know, third rail points of controversy. The challenge becomes when in any direction, there is a perspective that eradicates the humanity and the value and the self-worth of a person. That's a place for corrective. And I think that, you know, we need to understand that, because it is incredibly damaging for somebody to feel validated in having a perspective that is, again, dehumanizing and dismissive of another person's value and worth as a human being. Now, having said that, I think that there is immeasurable space and place for folk of different perspectives to come together, both in finding common ground. There are issues, I'm sure, that exist, and that, you know, that's often a heavy lift to find, but those do exist, to find that common ground. But even in the space of having diametrically opposite perspectives, to still give value and worth to each other. And that's, so I guess what I'm trying to say is, I think that ideal exists. We have to do that work, but at the same time, not allow for there to be perspectives and ideologies that hold sway, that dehumanize, that call for somebody being deemed or seen as less than because of their race, less than because of their gender, less than because of their sexuality, less than because of their socioeconomic status. I think it's important for us to be vigilant in not resting easy with that and making the distinction between that and having even diametrically opposite political perspectives around the wide swath of issues that we wrestle with every day.
So this is not rhetorical, but it'll sound rhetorical. Would you encourage young people to enter into the public square and to bring their gifts into the experiment of democracy?
I can't tell you enough of how much already there has been impact. And you know, you can go back and look generationally and see that has been the case over and over and over again. You know, the fact that some young people decided to sit down at a lunch counter in North Carolina has had an impact. The fact that young people who in the course of the civil rights movement that school children decided to show their disdain for a system of segregation, et cetera, had impact that resonates even today. So I think they're dramatic examples. But again, going back to what I was saying earlier on, there are absolutely, and let me just say this, I'm happy, of course, I'm biased, that there are great and wonderful young people who step into the realm of progressive politics and who stand, in that space and do great things. But you know what I also want, Scott? I want to make sure that there are talented and capable and principled young people who step into the public square for other perspectives. In Washington, D.C., our headquarters, the Democratic National Committee headquarters, are at 430 South Capitol. Literally, not even 2 blocks away is the Republican National Committee headquarters. I mean, and so much so that we always used to tell our interns, when you go to eat lunch, because there are a couple of restaurants right there, please don't, chatter about what meeting you just were in, because believe it or not, there are going to be some folk from the RNC there. And so my point being, the proximity there makes me realize that we need talent and capacity and capability and principled forthrightness in both places. I'm not going to vilify a significant portion of the nation. What I will do is, again, like I said earlier, I'll call to accountability people who are doing and saying things that are destructive to the American experiment, but I won't vilify people who happen to have perspectives that are differing than mine.
So I'm going to start to shift, and I hope any of you that would like to actually verbally ask a question, maybe you can start to come up and raise your hand, and I'll try to find you. And maybe I'm a bit of a dinosaur. Derrick is much better on the tech stuff. But this last Sunday, I was invited to speak at a very wonderful Lutheran congregation in our community, and the text was this famous John 3:16. And for better and worse, a lot of us know that text. In my research, there's a young man in September of 1954, in his first sermon at Drexel Hill Baptist Church, Martin Luther King spoke his first sermon, gave his first sermon on that text. And that text then propelled him into the public square, out of the Black church tradition, but also out of the great joy of loving the world and caring for the world. And we just went through a John Lewis conversation on campus that the Niebuhr Center led us through. And I always talk about, what did John Lewis carry in his backpack as he walked across that bridge and got his head broken open and almost died? Very few people know that in that backpack was a book by the famous Thomas Merton, Father Thomas Merton, who wrote a book, Seven Storey Mountain, and he carried that in his backpack. A person of faith carrying text. So the question is this, as we get closer, and it's one that is rooted in Abraham Joshua Heschel. Do you have a word for young people today, Reverend? Is there a word? You have been giving that, I know, and that is also a bit rhetorical.
No, it's fine.
But is there a word for young people today? And Rabbi Heschel gave that as he was finishing his life and was on national television. This is not national television. You're not about ready to die, pray God. But I know that there's a lot of hopelessness beyond the virus, beyond the frustrations of how we have had to live for the last year and a half, the political polarization. Where does one find hope?
Yeah, and I will say a couple of things about that as quickly as I can. I think that grasping kind of the existential in this moment, knowing that you are part of a larger conversation than the immediacy of your moment, is sometimes frustrating, because we all do want, let's be honest, we want to see the resultant effects of our commitment, pretty readily. And that's not always the case. I have out here in the hallway in our apartment a picture of my great-grandmother, my grandfather, and two of my great-uncles that was taken probably very, very early in the 20th century. And as maybe you can maybe you can tell by looking at me, my family sort of represents the full expanse of what happened to African Americans in the context of slavery and miscegenation and everything else in America. So there's a lot of story to be told as I look at their visages. And, of course, back in the day, you had to sit and be stern and still when the camera took your picture because the exposure was long. But one of the things I always think about when I look at that photograph, if I'd been thinking I would have brought it here so I could have shared it with you all. I apologize for not doing that. But one of the things I think about when I look at that is the fact that they were, I believe this in my heart of hearts, they were able, while they were mired in a situation that was indeed oppressive, which indeed was unequal, which was anchored in de jure and de facto segregation, even though they were in Kentucky, but still, fully, all of those things were present. There was a measure of forwardness in their aspect, in their faith, and in their perspective that had to be there. And the reason I say that it had to be there because otherwise, I just don't know how they would have been able to exist or to sustain existence. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I've got to believe that hope becomes engaged in our actions and in our work. I know someone in the questions here raised a very valid question about how do we disagree with people of global and economic matters when those opinions are rooted in the oppression of others. And I don't want anybody to think that I'm saying it's okay for people to have perspectives that are oppressive and as I said earlier on, using that Baldwin quote, that in some way limit me. I think what I'm trying to say is that the best sort of response is for me to be steeled in my commitment for the work toward justice, the work toward equity, the work toward what is right, and knowing that it is, again, not an immediate thing that will evidence itself conveniently and spontaneously. So I guess what I'm saying is maybe to young people, maybe it's a perspective that I wouldn't have had 20, 30 years ago, but I value the long haul. It doesn't mean you're going to have to wait 20 or 30 years, because I think that, again, we're on a trajectory that hopefully will get us out of this place where we are right now. But I do feel that having a sense of being part of a conversation that is larger than yourself is part of, when we look back at the great lights of our recent history and even further back, the thing that is consistent with all of them is that they had a perspective that was far larger than themselves. Even with their vaunted places in history, they saw themselves as part of a larger conversation. So that's what I would hope rest in the heart and the zeal of amazing young people today.
So, and I put up, one of our professors has lifted up a book, but I hope you all know this, The Audacity of Hope. Does that ring any bells to all of you, Reverend, and anybody? The Audacity of Hope. Please, Karen, put it up there on a chat or.
Absolutely.
Because The Audacity of Hope was written by, help me all.
I won't give it away.
John, don't raise your hand. Somebody type it in the chat so that we all see it, please.
It was by Barack Obama.
Absolutely. Now, many of you don't know, but hopefully you have read in the opening preface. The title of that book was a sermon by,
there you go,
Dr. Jeremiah Wright, when he received his honorary doctorate at Elmhurst College and preached the baccalaureate sermon. His title of his sermon was The Audacity of Hope. And Barack Obama uses that title and recognizes it in the preface of that book. So I'm anxious for those of us who are asking hope, despair, frustration, rage, anger, Use these markers, the Audacity of Hope, the story of Dr. Jeremiah Wright, which is a conflicted story, but I think the world of Dr. Wright, and he has an honorary degree from Elmhurst. And the life of some of these dignitaries and people. We are cutting along and we're getting 2 minutes into closure. If I am a good Presbyterian and anal and uptight. But I also know that students need to get to pizza and studies and other things tonight. And I want to honor our time. Other comments, and then Derrick, I'd love for you to offer a few final closing remarks and
Sure.
both of thanks. I hope you're hearing a great resounding thank you for all that you've given, your time, your witness, your love. I'm so anxious for you to speak on campus sometime, to be a part of our life, of our community. It might be helpful, and you know this, but might be helpful to help you in your closing remarks. Elmhurst University is about to start its 150th anniversary. What are the things that Elmhurst needs to wrestle with in its 150th university year?
Yeah.
Softball question.
You know, I will just say this, and by the way, thank you all so very much for this wonderful time together. I just deeply appreciate sharing with you. I will say, you know, I'm optimistic because my goodness, I don't like the alternative. But at the same time, I think I come to that optimism with a measure of hopefully well-earned wisdom and a perspective that keeps me in the fray, keeps me in the fight, as opposed to just simply nodding in resignation to people whose perspectives are less than affirming for me. I will say this, an institution and the people who make up the institution, what an opportunity to step into the rest of this century with the zeal of really helping to make sure that the narrative is one that points us to the fulfillment of the promise that you know we celebrate. I found it. I want to just show you this. When you talk about hope, from my perspective, I hope I can do this. This is what hope looks like circa 1901. This is what hope looks like when the laws and the customs deny you your humanity. This is what hope looks like when you have to be anchored in your own sense of self-worth and stand up and against all the things that would push against you. The gentleman on the far, I guess that would be all the way over to the right, is my grandfather, my two great uncles in the middle, and my great grandmother on the other side. And I often think about the fact, you know, Scott, one of the things I must say, every time I've walked into the White House, every time I've walked into those halls of power, there's never been a time when I haven't on some level thought about them or thought about even my parents of blessed memory. And I think about, for them, me standing in the East Room at the podium giving a prayer would have been divide by zero. It just wouldn't have even been comprehensible. But at the same time, I don't think it would not have assaulted their sense of hopefulness. So I just say all of that to say that I really think it's important to have a sense of audacious hopefulness, an outrageousness in our expectations of what we can accomplish and what we can demand of the society that we live in. I think then we're living out our faith ideals, then we're living out our ideals in the public sector, in the public square, and hopefully, you know, it'll mean that on the other side of things, we'll be able to look back and say that we've been a part of what's right and what's just, and even with the adversity that comes, that we've stayed the course. So I just want to encourage people on this call and beyond to not lose that measure of hope and to be applicable in every measure.
Your life is a blessing, my friend, and I want to thank you on behalf of our university community. For those of you who are around tomorrow at 12 noon, we will be gathering outside of the chapel for prayers and silence and remembrance for the 1-year anniversary of COVID-19. Wherever you are tomorrow, pause at 12 noon and give thanks and pray for those who have lost life this night Faith Over Fear is about that, trying to figure out how to put together all the pieces and walk in love. Blessings to all of you. Reverend Doctor, thank you so much from all of us here. We want you on campus. Take care, all.
Blessings.
Blessings.
Blessings
Good
to
night.
you all.